Athens boasts many fine historic houses that testify to the richness of the city's past. Each house has its story and each its special significance, some as architectural monuments, others as landmarks in the city's development, and still others as reminders of the exceptional people who have made Athens their home. But all these houses are part of a larger saga, that of the ongoing efforts of Athenians to protect their heritage by preserving the historic structures of their community. These are the stories of just a few of the houses that have assured Athens the continuing presence of the past. In 1801, Athens was founded and the University of Georgia first opened its doors, and from those earliest days, the histories of town and gown have been closely intertwined. The oldest house still standing in Athens was built by Alonzo Church, a university professor of mathematics, and its first occupant was Moses Waddell, president of the university from 1819 to 1829. This simple house, with its fine federal detail, nearly doubled in size as additions were made over the years. By the 1960s, the house was threatened with destruction. Fortunately, the Athens Clark Heritage Foundation saved the structure and restored it according to its original plan, thereby providing a record of what the city was like in the 1820s. By the mid-19th century, the university was thriving and Athens was becoming the economic and commercial center of northeast Georgia. In this view of Athens, painted by George Cook in the mid-1840s, the prospering town and university can be seen on facing hills in the distance. On the Oconee River stands the Athens factory, an appropriate symbol of the region's flourishing economy. East of the Oconee are the cars of the Georgia Railroad, clear signs of Athens' growing connections with the world at large. That railroad had its beginnings in the Camac House. Here, in 1834, former mathematics professor James Camac invited a group of businessmen to organize the Georgia Railroad. Camac was elected president of the railroad, which was the first in Georgia and only the third in the nation. What is probably the finest brickwork in Athens can be seen in the corner pilasters and other ornamental details of this graceful federal-style structure. Athens' prosperity in the years preceding the Civil War helped secure the future of the university, which for 3 decades was under the leadership of Dr. Alonzo Church. Besides building President Waddell's residence, Dr. Church constructed a charming country house, which John Barrow, one of his descendants, lives in today.
Hello. Welcome to Homewood. This place was built back in 1830 by a forebear of mine, Dr. Alonzo Church, who was the president of the University of Georgia. When he lived in town, he stayed at the Chancellor House, which was the home of the president of the University of Georgia at that time, and a home located where the main library building is now on North Campus. When school wasn't in session and on weekends when he wanted to get away from town life, he'd come out to his place out here in the country in Five Points. Come on in.
This is one of 3 remaining houses in Athens built on the side hall plan. Here you can see the wide heart pine boards which were used in the walls, floors, and ceilings. The focal point of the parlor is this attractive sunburst mantel. Dr. Church was a sometimes controversial figure, an educational conservative, and a strict disciplinarian. At one time he called for and got the resignation of the entire faculty. He was well respected by many town citizens, however, and in 1856 the city gave him a commemorative silver service, had this inscription: a token of affectionate remembrance from the citizens of Athens to the Reverend Alonzo Church, Doctor of Divinity, 1856. The silver service was made in Athens by Ace of King Charles. I believe it's kept in a bank vault these days. In the dining room are portraits of a couple of ancestors of mine. Wilson Lumpkin, governor of Georgia from 1831 to 1835, and James Barrow, who was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army when he was killed at the age of 23 in the Battle of Olustee in Florida. This is another famous Athenian, Howell Cobb, who was, among other things, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives and a little later governor of Georgia.
This Greek Revival house with simple Doric columns was built for Howell Cobb and his family in 1850, shortly before he left Washington to assume his position as governor.
Like many other old Athens residences, this house originally stood at the center of a lot covering an entire city block.
A pair of portraits of Howell Cobb and his wife, Mary Ann Lamar Cobb, are among the cherished possessions of the couple's descendants who still live in this house.
In the hall is a print of Howell Cobb swearing Jefferson Davis in as President of the Confederacy. Howell Cobb also served as Secretary of the Treasury under James Buchanan and as a general in the Confederate Army. The grandfather clock was purchased in Germany in 1849 for the new house.
Sarah Irwin Leathers, great-granddaughter of Howell Cobb.
This portrait of Howell Cobb was done by a Philadelphia artist during one of his terms in Washington. Mary Ann Lamar's fan, which is still in my possession, was given to her by the ambassador from China. When Howell Cobb left Washington, the portraits were sent south and were hung in this house. Then this is my granddaughter and namesake, Sarah Farr. She and her 3 brothers are the 7th generation to live in this house.
Another early Athens house is Moss Side, built by Hiram Hayes in 1839. This is the birthplace of Dr. Lorenzo Moss, who discovered the technique of blood typing while engaged in research at the Johns Hopkins University Hospital. Descendants of Dr. Moss continue to make Moss Side their home. The Taylor-Grady house was named for General Robert Taylor, who built it in the mid-1840s, and for Henry W. Grady, spokesman for the New South, who lived here with his family while studying at the university. Its 13 Doric columns linked by a twisted wire railing make the Taylor-Grady house distinctive among Athens Greek Revival houses. The Athens Junior League, which has restored and maintained the building, makes its headquarters here today. In her home nearby, Susan Barrow Tate, a Taylor descendant, recalls one of the early residents of the Taylor-Grady house.
This is Susan Holmes Taylor, the daughter of Richard Delona Bowling Taylor and his wife, Sarah Jane Billups. Little Susie was born in the Taylor-Grady house on Prince Avenue, and this portrait was painted in that front yard. She was 3 years old and obviously did not want her portrait painted, as you can tell from her expression. In her lap, she seems to have a bunch of flowers. That isn't true. What she had in her lap was a dish of ice cream, and her nurse sat to one side and fed it to Susie to keep her quiet long enough so that the artist could have some vague idea of what she looked like. Little Susie grew up and married Frederick B. Lucas. They had 6 children. The last child, my mother, was a girl, although she was supposed to have been a boy, but they went right ahead and named her Henry Hull Lucas. At the training house, you know, there are portraits of little Susie's father and grandfather. The early history of the house is rather complicated. Of course, it was the birthplace of Miss Millie Rutherford, and for the last 50 years it has been owned by Taylor descendants. It's actually a very simple Greek Revival house with a portico supported by attenuated Gothic columns that are unusual in the Athens area. If you go in the hallway, you'll see wide hot pine flooring. A simple balcony stair, and a portrait of Susie's father, Richard Deloney Bowling Taylor. In the living room, you'll find a portrait of her grandfather, who built the Taylor-Grady house. The settees in the living room came from the Taylor-Grady house. And over the simple Greek Revival mantel, you'll see a portrait of her father when he was a boy. The secretary in the corner is an unusually fine example of early Georgia-made furniture.
Mrs. Tate herself lives in an interesting Victorian cottage which her grandparents moved into in 1890. Her grandfather, David Crenshaw Barrow, lived in this house until he became chancellor of the university in 1906.
The house was originally a 5-room cottage. My grandmother just really couldn't put up with that tower room, so she had it taken down and had another gable put on the house. The house now has 15 rooms and 14 gables. We are in one of the original rooms of this house. I rather doubt that it was a parlor. This may have been a bedroom in the 1880s.
This was the study of Mrs. Tate's husband, the much-beloved William Tate, Dean of Men at the university for so many years. Mrs. Tate's house stands at one end of historic Deering Street, at the other end of which is a famous Athens landmark, the tree that owns itself. Local legend says that Colonel William H. Jackson deeded 8 feet of ground at its base to a giant white oak, parent of the tree that stands here now. He enjoyed the oak from his house across the way, a charming cottage built in the late 1820s, to which additions have been made over the years. The magnolia, ginkgo, and upland cypress were probably part of an 1830s botanical garden. On a frosty day in January 1891, 12 Athens women formed the nation's first garden club here, in the E.K. Lumpkin House, a graceful antebellum structure with handsome ironwork. The President's House is one of Athens' most lavish residences. Completed in 1858, for what was then the considerable sum of $25,355. Outside, it is relatively faithful to the Greek Revival mode. The 2-story porch is supported by 14 Corinthian columns. The heroic proportions of the porch are accentuated by the raised brick basement, which undergirds the 2 frame stories. Inside, the house is more mid-Victorian in style. Particularly noteworthy in the parlor is the elaborate plasterwork. Originally, an arch spanned the middle of the room. The sitting room features an Italian brown marble mantelpiece which matches the one in the dining room. Athens treasures gardens and gardeners.
I'm Grover Gresham. I've been working at the President's Home about around 35 years for sure. And quite interested to work here. It was always a pleasure. It was fun to work here and to notice importance about the box garden. The box garden is probably the same all except the lowness of the plant. You can notice the tall one and the short one. They once all were the same height. Here we are now in the backyard. The little house was built before the big house was. Over here is the rose garden. And beyond that is the camellia walk. Now I would like to say from the front to the back, all of it was designed and laid out by Hubert Owen.
Many fine Athens dwellings, like the President's House, survive today, but sadly, several have fallen victim to the wrecking ball. Like this Italianate mansion, complete with cupola, demolished in 1965. The unusual Lambkin Mell House, with its Gothic columns and lyre-like capitals, leveled in the 1960s. And these twin neoclassical mansions, connected by an Ionic colonnade, also destroyed during the 1960s. Fortunately, however, Athenians have found various ways of preserving many of the city's historic houses, such as the palatial James White House, designed by Neil Reed and completed in 1923, which is now used as a fraternity chapter house. The Franklin Upson House, one of the finest Greek Revival houses in Georgia, which became a bank in 1974, and which subsequently won an award for adaptive usage of a historic structure. Or the Thomas Carruthers House, Athens' most exuberant example of Beaux-Arts classicism, which today is home to a sorority. Through adaptive use, a number of Athens' fine old buildings, like the Thomas Carruthers House, have been saved. But what remains fundamental in the movement to preserve Athens' historic houses is the ongoing efforts of many Athenians to ensure the future of these structures as private residences, such as the Newton House, the home of two retired educators who were born and reared here in the house their father built. The Jester House, recently restored to its late Victorian splendor. The neighboring Sledge Cobb Spalding House, with its triple gables and pronounced Gothic Revival influence, restored by a history professor and his wife for themselves and their children. Through their efforts, the walls of this house continue to echo with the sounds of family life. Thanks to the dedication and foresight of their elders, young Athenians and generations to come will know a world that has preserved the presence of the past.